Hello and welcome back to Survey of Biology for Unit 14, Evidence for Evolution. And as we learned in the last unit, we talked about how evolution actually takes place. We talked about natural selection, how certain individuals have adaptations that give them a higher chance for survival, that leads to higher reproduction rate, that leads to higher gene frequencies in the next generation. And what we're going to look at this unit is what type of evidence, what are we looking at either in the fossil record or in the genetic record of how evolution takes place. So if you can see from the diagram here, there's a lot of different pieces of information that feed into the theory of evolution. And we're going to look at a few of them in particular. So like the fossil record, transitional forms, we're going to look at the anatomy. We're going to look at the genetic code and DNA homology, so how closely related are individuals or different species in terms of evolution. So these are different types of evidence that we're going to look at that will help us explain how evolution is taking place. The first bit of evidence that we're going to look at is anatomical evidence. What does the organism actually look like? And the big thing is we're going to talk about these two things, homology and analogy. So homologous structures are things like the bat wing, the mouse forelimb, and the human arm, that they're all basically the same bones put together slightly differently. Analogous structures are things like the bat wing, butterfly wing, and bird wing that are very, very different structures, but they look similar because they perform a similar function. The second piece of evidence that we'll look at is embryology, or the development. And the idea here is that the more closely two species are related, the longer into development they appear similar to each other. So if you look at the human and the monkey in this diagram over here, the human and the monkey, during development, embryologically, they look very, very similar until a very late stage. Whereas if we compare the human to the salamander down here, they start to differentiate and look different much earlier. So this idea of the phylogeny, how they look in the ontogeny, the process of development, we'll take a look at that. The third and last piece of evidence that we'll look at are going to be protein and DNA analysis. And we've done a little bit of this in class already, where we look at the number of amino acids or base pair differences. And so between humans and chimpanzees for this one protein called cytochrome C, there's no differences. So that tells us that we split relatively recently from chimpanzees. Whereas the rhesus monkey has one difference to rabbit, 9, and all the way down to yeast with 42. So you can come up with an idea of how closely or distantly related species are based on their protein and DNA analysis. So in this section, what we're going to look at is the anatomical similarities. So we can see in the human evolution here, from steps 1 through 6 to kind of modern Homo sapiens, here we can see that there are structural differences. We can see kind of the missing link, if you will, as we go through. So the shrinking of the jawbone, the increase in the cranium size. So those are things that we can look at from the fossil record that say, hey, these two species look similar. They might be related, or they might be closely related. Another way to look at anatomy, and kind of one of the most famous examples, is the evolution of the horse, from its kind of prehistoric ancestor, the Eohippus, all the way up to the modern Equus here, the horse here. And what they've looked at is leg bones, and you can see as we go through, we see the reduction of kind of the number of toes to the hooved animal, the hooved horse that we have today. And so from this type of information, we can actually construct a family tree. And we'll go through at the end of this unit and make something called a cladogram that will put together, so way back for the very distant relatives all the way up to kind of the modern horse as we go through here, and put together really a family tree of what they look like. So analogous and homologous. So analogous structures have the same function. They're going to look similar because they do the same thing, but they differ in their fundamental structure. They're not put together with the same bones, if you will, like the wrist bone and forearm bones of a bat wing and a human arm. And what this means is they've got different ancestry. So this is called convergent evolution. They look similar because they're adapted to similar environments. So the example is wings in bats, birds, and insects. They all look similar because they're doing a similar job, but they came from very different places in terms of evolution. Now we contrast that with homologous structures, which have different functions. Flippers and arms and wings are very different functions, but they're similar in their fundamental structure. They have adapted the same basic building blocks or pieces, bones, to do a job that they need. And what this shows is a common ancestry. So this is divergent evolution. They had a common ancestor and they've diverged from there since then. So the example, pentadactyl limb invertebrate, so that is kind of the five-fingered limb. So whether you have a bat, a whale, or a human, they've all got the same basic fundamental structure, and they've diverged from a common ancestor. So here's a diagram that shows this. So over on the left, the analogous structures, streamlined appendages. So the shark, the penguin, and the dolphin all have fins flippers that look the same, but they're put together very, very differently because they came from different places. So this is convergent evolution. They look similar, but they've got very different ancestors. And we can contrast that to the right where we've got the homologous structures. So here's the pentadactyl, so five-fingered limbs. So humans, cats, whales, and bats are all put together with the same pieces. Now the pieces have changed over time, and so if we look at the forearm bones here in humans, the radius in the ulna, they look different in the cat. One is extended. They look very squat and short in the whale, and one is reduced in the bat. But you can see that they're the same bone. They came from a common ancestor and have diverged from there. So analogous structures, again, just to kind of reiterate that and wrap it up, the bat wing, the bird wing, and the insect wing, they are used for the same job. In this case, flying. They look similar, but they don't have a common ancestor. No recent common ancestor. So they're an example of what we call convergent evolution. And again, to kind of wrap up, the homologous structures. So here's a turtle limb, a dolphin, a human, and a horse. They all have the same basic bone structure. And again, the homologous is evidence of divergent evolution. So they had a common ancestor that had some bones in common, and they have adapted to different habitats, different niches over the course of time. So here's an example of a human and a dog, and you can see from the color coding, they've got basically the same parts. Now the parts may look different in terms of the skull and the jaw, the forelimbs and the hind limbs, the phalanges, the toes and fingers, the spinal cord, the muscles involved, the pelvis, but they came from the same place. We share a common ancestor. We're both mammals. And then the other piece of evidence, other than homologous and analogous structures, is these things called vestigial structures. So these are structures in an organism that has lost all or most of its original function in the course of evolution, such as human appendixes. We have an appendix, but we don't really use it for anything. Snakes and whales have a pelvic and vestigial leg bones. They don't have rear legs, but they've got the bones that are evidence that they had an ancestor that did. The vestigial toes in the horse, they have a hoof now, but they've got the vestigial bones that show they used to have toes. So here's an example of the appendix in humans. Way down here, there's our appendix, which is a little kind of offshoot of the large intestine, and ours has been greatly reduced because over time, because of our changes in diet, we don't need it anymore. But some other animals like the koala and the zebra here is still much enlarged. It's called the cecum. And the opossum, you can see, is much closer to what the human has. And so over time, the structure has been expanded in some animals. So the koala eating eucalyptus, they need to have more time in the gut for that leaf matter to break down, whereas the humans, we don't need to keep the food in our gut as long as it passes through to get there. So that's a vestigial structure. And another one that I had mentioned before is pelvic bones in a whale. Whales don't have rear legs, but They evolved from mammals that were originally on land that did walk, and they have gradually lost them over time. So there's another example of a vestigial structure in an organism. So there's the first unit, the first piece of evidence for Unit 14 in terms of anatomical similarities. And so I hope you join us next time when we talk about embryological development, and we will see you soon.